Episode 1. Greg. Greg stood on the top level of Tower 1. Tower, admittedly, was a bit of a misnomer for something constructed to the scale of a geographical feature. At 4 kilometers up, it was the highest point in Lavina. From above, it looked like a 6-pointed star encircled by a hexagon. 57 similarly sized polyhedral shapes surrounded Tower 1, making up the rest of the city. When taken in all at once, it looked like an expanse of titanic bioluminescent life at the bottom of some primordial sea. Each tower was a miniature city in itself, containing everything from living and recreational centers to schools and factories. Accelerated walkways and rapid transit rails webbed throughout and between the towers, each subsection and neighborhood connected by no more than a few degrees of separation. Lasers, revealed by the clouds and fog, shone out from each tower's atomically smooth surface, piercing through the night like fingers reaching for something beyond the blasted landscape. In the center of the city, the near-perfect circle of Old Town was a bruise against the rest of the shining megalopolis. Centuries-old brick buildings slouched against each other under the endless torrent of rain, their mold-blackened windows reflecting the twisted strokes of lightning that danced across monotonous clouds. In the same way that a body puts layers of fluid and calcium around a tumor, a moat had been constructed around Old Town. 3 miles wide and flooded with water from the nearby lake, the barrier separated Old Town's urban malignancy from the laser-light fever dream of Lavina. 6 poorly maintained bridges crossed the moat, their old-style concrete so eroded that vehicle-sized holes revealed the churning water below. All of this was hidden to Greg. The hall in which he stood wore holograms like overdone ball gowns. Designed to look like a pre-Inferno days shoreline, projected movements insinuated rather than mimicked the waves of a beach. The smell of salt and recorded squawking of long-extinct waterbirds added to the illusion. In the ceiling, indistinct winged shapes swooped across a make-believe sky. Greg noticed none of this, focused instead on the door before him and on the fear of what waited beyond. He took a deep, shuddering breath, mentally white-knuckling his last shreds of composure. "Well," Greg said, his own voice seeming to come from far away, "let's face the music." The man standing next to him didn't respond. His name was Austin, and like Greg, he studied the door. Rather than fear, however, his face held a look of grim determination. He was shorter than Greg, but broad-shouldered and powerfully built. Wide, flat cheekbones gave way to a grotesque near absence of a lower jaw. Something had torn it away years ago. What little bone was left had been wired together and turned into a perfunctory chin that dangled from Austin's face like jello held in an upside-down spoon. "Scooped out like a melon baller," Austin had signed once, when he'd caught Greg staring in morbid fascination. Greg still remembered the awkwardness of the moment. He never stared at Austin's missing jaw after that, and Austin never again brought it up. Greg reached up, unconsciously running his fingers through his thinning hairline, causing several droplets of fear-tinted sweat to trickle out of his salt and pepper hair and down his forehead. "Do you think he's going to kill us?" Greg asked, this time speaking directly to Austin. Austin shrugged, letting out a huff of frustration. "I'm not sure," he signed. "Depends on whether or not the boss is in a forgiving mood." "I'm constantly impressed with the amount of sarcasm you manage to express using only your eyebrows," Greg said, trying and failing to cut through his fear. "I'm impressed too," Austin replied. "Never seen you so scared. I can hear the tremble in your voice." "For good reason," Greg retorted, dropping his voice to a whisper. "The rejuvenation process is excruciatingly painful for Mr. Adarak. It makes him irritable." You make it seem like he's a rabid dog, Austin replied, rolling his eyes. He's dangerous, sure, but not unreasonable. Fine, Greg said, taking a small half-shuffled step back. You open the door, then. Austin sighed, shaking his head as he stepped forward and wrapped his short, powerful fingers around the door's burnished steel handle. The latch opened with a soft click-clunk, followed immediately by the sucking of air being displaced by pressure change. The resulting wind smelled heavily of iodine and sulfur, sharp, metallic, and underlain with the burr of slowly rotting vegetation. The smell assaulted Greg's nostrils, catching in his sinuses so that he immediately had to fight the urge to gag. He squinted watering eyes against an incessant yellow light that spilled through the door's widening gap. Accompanying all this was an echoing crash thud that made Greg think of a Titanic power washer. He followed Austin as they walked directly towards the light and sound, blind, deafened, and nauseous. After about 10 paces, his eyes adjusted. Around him spread the closest thing to a real beach anyone in the city had seen in over 200 years. Pebbles lay so thick he couldn't see the burnished titanium that made up the floor underneath. Less than 20 feet away, pump-generated waves crashed into the artificial beach. Greg averted his eyes, not wanting to look out over the water. Every time he did, his stomach and inner ears did loop-de-loops at the sight of the horizon. It went into a sickening forever. Greg knew this was just an illusion, a trick of angles and light designed to give a 50-foot-wide wave pool the appearance of infinity. Knowledge made no difference to his inner ear, which was convinced it was being pushed up and forwards into an expanse of distant clouds. Greg focused on the back of Austin's neck as they walked, swallowing hard against the nauseous way his mouth kept watering. It felt like someone had dumped a pellet of concentrated degreaser into his guts. Gasping, he fell to his knees and scrambled to open his briefcase. His fingers fumbled against the latch, failing to grip once, twice, until, with a soft click, the case opened. Within lay only 3 objects: a bottle of water, several tablets of antihistamine sealed in wax paper, and an unmarked, leather-bound tome. Greg tore open the antihistamine's wrapping and popped 3 tablets into his mouth. He chewed them quickly, following them with 2 tentative sips of water. The nausea tried to return, but with a few measured breaths he was able to fight it back down. Austin tapped him on the shoulder, causing him to sway unsteadily. "What?" Greg half spat, half coughed, grabbing the tome and the rest of the antihistamine tablets before resealing his briefcase. He forced himself to stand, risking a brief glimpse at the shoreline to test if his stomach had truly settled. Satisfied that it had, he read Austin's hand sign. "Get yourself together." He pointed, guiding Greg's gaze up the beach. 10 paces away, practically within spitting distance, stood their employer. Greg felt his body run cold and hot at the same time, like being frozen then dipped in bubbling grease. Felix Adarac's gaze bore down on the 2 approaching men, inhuman in its steady flatness. The pupils, unnaturally large even under the blasting light of the room's artificial sun, conveyed no emotion. Everything from Felix's neck down was encased within a sarcophagus of what looked like baked clay. The parts of him which could be seen, his balding head and withered face, skin pooled paper thin and nearly translucent under the intense light of the artificial sun, looked more like something which had been exhumed rather than parts of a living entity. But Greg knew that this appearance was temporary at best. Felix Adarac was a man perpetually at war with time itself. He used the engineers employed by Adarac Incorporated to arm himself against his implacable foe. That's why this room was built after all, to give Felix a place to relax while the machines within the coffin healed and reconstructed him at the molecular level. The process was, by all accounts, beyond excruciating. Once the machine was done, however, Felix could walk out with a purpose-built body capable of living for several more decades. "Welcome, Greg," Felix said, voice tight with controlled agony. "It's been some time since you came here. Didn't think you had it in you." "I'm not sure I do," Greg thought to himself, willing his stomach to cooperate. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, sir," Greg said, not breaking eye contact. "It's urgent." "It always is," Felix said. "Why don't you fill me in?" Greg hesitated, only for a moment, to consider the best way for him to broach the subject. Within that moment, Austin signed. "The opus has been stolen." "By whom?" Felix asked, his displeasure betrayed by only the slightest grinding of teeth. "Research assistant Sarah Moore seems to have taken it," Austin signed. Felix's brow furrowed as he considered the name. "Dr. Clarkson's lab assistant?" "Yes," Austin answered. "Why?" "We think it had something to do with the accident, sir," Greg said, interrupting Austin's reply. "She saw what happened to the doctor up close. It would affect anyone." "Ah," Felix replied. "That would make sense. Why didn't we have her evaluated after the accident?" "We did, Mr. Adarak. She was glowing green across the board. There was no sign of this," Greg said. "Then that must not be the reason." "I can't think what else it could be, sir," Greg replied. "She was bought," Austin signed, shrugging. "The Thornhill Corporation's been trying to snipe her for years." "Exactly," Greg answered. "She shows nothing but loyalty for years, and then what? Decides to go turncoat on us right before our biggest breakthrough? No, that doesn't make sense. There's something else at work here." Felix considered this, falling silent for several minutes as various muscles in his neck jerked uncontrollably, lolling his head back and forth like a ball at the end of a string. "What of your tome, Greg?" Felix finally asked, holding his head still long enough to look Greg in the eyes. "What can it show us?" Greg knelt, setting his briefcase wide side down on the pebbled floor and placing his tome on top of it. Greg opened the tome with both hands, causing tissue-thin papers to flutter as the cover spread. The majority of the tome was blank, just empty paper with nothing on it. Years of employment as head portent for Adarak Incorporated had used up the majority of his tome, despite Greg's best efforts to be sparing with his disruptions. Still, 35 years was an excellent run for any portent, especially one with an 85% accuracy rating. Greg gently, reverently, turned the pages until he came to where he had left off. The top half of the page was blank, but the bottom half was covered with a spidery text that circled in on itself as it moved and squirmed its way across the page. Its movement always reminded Greg of mosquito larvae swimming in a puddle. To anyone else, it would be incomprehensible and mildly repulsive. To Greg, however, it was all the usefulness he had left to give. His last bit of magic on a stack of pages no thicker than a children's book, alive and ready to be used up like kindling. Once it was gone, however. "I have set aside enough disruptions to get us 2 queries," Greg said, forcing himself away from that line of thought. "We will direct them towards Sarah herself, namely, where she will be and who bought her off." Austin nodded in agreement. Felix started to nod, winced, then grunted out, "Just start already." Greg read aloud from his tome, using words that left dirty fingerprints on the lens of reality. His eyes glazed over as a resonant gong filled the room. The symbols on the page drifted towards each other as if pulled by a current, erupting into a small circle of opalescent green flame as they formed the first disruption. "Where is Sarah Thea Moore going?" Greg asked the small blaze. The flame grew in circumference, tongues of fire unfolding like the petals of a flower. In the middle of each tongue of flame was an image, a picture of Sarah. Despite their small size, each flame no more than a few inches across, all three men could see the images in exquisite detail. They began to move, the Sarah in each one performing almost the same action as the rest, only slightly out of sync with the others. Each image was its own distinct, possible future. In the clearest image, Sarah was at the controls of an individual transport pod. She had somehow engaged its emergency protocols, persuading the dumb AI to extend rubber wheels out from its rounded undercarriage. She had apparently driven the pod off its assigned track using the wheels, and was going down an old maintenance access road. Judging by the road's condition, it was one that the caretakers hardly ever used anymore. The scene shifted, and Sarah stood in front of a decrepit brick building, its windows boarded up. The surroundings were bleak, slouching brick monoliths from a bygone era, only still standing to spite the rain and time itself. The pavement had cracks, through which a thick, gray-green mud seeped to mingle with the rain. A thick, medical-grade mask covered her face and nose, probably more to protect her from the smell than anything. Sarah produced a key from one of her pockets, plunged it into the door's lock, and disappeared into the building. "Old Town," Felix spat, breath hissing through gritted teeth in disgust. "To steal is one thing, but to take it there." "Yes," Austin agreed, eyes narrowed as he memorized every detail of the scene. "Very distasteful." Greg ignored them, reading aloud the second group of sounds and calling forth the second disruption. "Who benefits from Sarah's actions?" Greg asked the tome. He could have used her full name again, but didn't. The tome had the scent of her now, and she would never again be completely out of its sight. The scenes on the flames shifted, now expanding upwards. They were spanning up away from the city, now level with the tops of the massive towers, now past them, out beyond the ever-present rain clouds and smog, into the dark brightness of space. The image shifted then, moving in a direction that none of the viewers could understand. For some reason, the word that simultaneously popped into all of their heads was, "aside from." Despite the clarity of the images, they could see nothing, neither stars nor specks of dust, just darkness. The darkness had shape, form. Something looked out at them. It hit each of them differently as their minds processed what they saw. Madness, thought Austin, pulling his gaze away. He was breathing fast, cold sweat on his neck. "Hunger," mumbled Felix to himself, a sense of giddy companionship filling his chest. "The absence," Greg choked out, sinking to his knees as tears once again blurred his vision. With a shudder, he reached out to close the tome. The cover didn't budge. Greg's breathing became labored, veins and tendons popping into view on the back of his hands as he strained against the force which held the tome open against his will. He could sense the dark shape reaching out to the power of his disruption, burning like a signal flare against the infinite black. The tome grew hot as a skillet over fire, but Greg refused to let go of it. Something close to madness possessed him as he stood, heaving with his legs and putting his whole body into the action of shutting the tome. Sweat broke out on his face as the coppery taste of blood filled the back of his throat. With the sudden quickness of a snapping rubber band, the tome shut, Greg collapsed back onto the beach, fatigue washing over him. His hands felt swollen. He looked at his fingers, expecting to see them melted together. They were fine, albeit twitching involuntarily with tremors of fatigue and remembered pain. None of them spoke, each recalling the shape in the darkness and what it had made them experience. Only Felix knew what it meant. "We're running out of time," Felix muttered, finally breaking the silence. "Do you know which building she went into?" "We will within the hour," Austin signed. "My people are combing through her things as we speak." "Good. Beat her to Old Town. When you get there, bring back what she stole," Felix said. "Good as done, boss," Austin replied. "Wherever she goes, we'll reach her before any more damage is done." After a moment's thought, Felix added, "I don't want my fucking brother finding out about this. When you find her, have the men investigating her exiled or killed." "Mr. Atarak," Austin signed, "my men are trustworthy. They'll take this to their graves if I tell them to." "Trustworthy?" Felix snarled, spitting the word like a curse. "What you can trust is that if word gets back to Will, all three of us will be taking this to our graves much earlier than we'd like. Got me? This has to be kept beyond quiet." "We got you," Greg said hurriedly. "Consider it done. By tomorrow, it will be like none of this happened." He glared sideways at Austin, willing his subordinate to keep his metaphorical mouth shut. "I hope so, Gregory. For all our sake." With that, Felix closed his eyes. The two men were dismissed. Without another word, they backed out of the room. Their orders had been given. Sarah was a dead woman. She just didn't know it yet. You have been listening to Dead Arcology, written and recorded by me, Michael K. Austice. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing it. I have episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean, as well as several others. Updates, schedules, and news can be found on the website, deadarcology.com, as well as on the social media apps Blue Sky and Instagram under the username Dead Arcology. If you want to help Dead Arcology grow more directly, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/deadarcology. Thank you again for listening. It really helps a lot. I very much appreciate you giving this story your time, and I will see you in about 2 weeks. Goodbye.